into brushing off the weirdness, I noticed something on the horizon. A gray smudge that seemed to be getting on his face didn't alter in the slightest, and neither did his stride as he approached. His mouth opened, and a voice as gray as a tombstone said, to my nose, and I had to resist the need. It was more than an urge to vomit. What I smelled could only be described as death, plain and simple. It assaulted my nostrils and filled my mind with images of death and destruction, things I could never have pictured on my own. War-torn battlefields scattered with the flesh and blood of innocent people, bodies torn apart by animals, corpses swaying in the breeze, glassy eyes still begging for a savior even though it was far too late. I gasped, pressing my hands to my mouth and nose and hurried away. For a few minutes the smell was gone, but the images and nausea remained. He continued walking forward, eyes on the horizon, fists clenched around the trash bag in his hand. I stopped moving and simply stared at him as he passed, begging my mind to make sense of what was happening. Something in the bag sloshed, and the smell of blood and death overwhelmed me, making me feel sick all over again. I pressed my hands into my eyes, but when I opened them, the gray man was still there, walking away from me, his pace the same as ever. I forced myself to root to the spot and watch him walk away. I waited until the shadows grew longer, and he was once again just a gray smudge on the horizon. When I turned back around, I was angry but not surprised to see the gray smear in front of me again. I sighed and continued walking, telling myself it was a coincidence, or I was imagining things. But as he came back into focus, a distant part of my mind screamed that I was in danger. I made the mistake of shoving that voice and its wisdom to the back of my mind. I had to get home. I didn't want to walk in the tall grass and risk getting a tick, and the gray man was going to be there no matter what I did, so I might as well follow the tracks until I made it back home. This time when the gray man got closer, the smell was the first thing that greeted me. It choked down my vomit and blinked tears from my eyes as I took a deep breath and held it. When the man was about 10 feet from me, something in his smile changed. He didn't move exactly, but his lower jaw seemed to grow, as if the hinges of his jaw were melting and allowing his face to sink lower and lower. For the first time, his eyes met mine, and I knew I had made a horrible mistake. By the time he passed me, his jaw was down to his chest, but his eyes had never left mine. Once he was behind me, I began sprinting, only interested in getting home before it was completely dark. Up ahead, I could see the bright blue X I had spray painted on the tree, and I veered away from the tracks again, now running through the grass with no other thought in mind than getting back home. But as I ran, my vision began to blur slightly. The shadows of the trees turned gray and seemed to take on more form. Something gray appeared right in front of the tree I had painted on, slowly morphing into a gray man walking towards me, trash bag swinging from his hand. I halted, waited until he was a few feet from me, then bolted to the side into the tree line. I crashed through the trees wildly, paying attention to nothing except the gray smudges that would appear in front of me, taking shape into the man more rapidly each time. By the time I saw my house in the distance, the gray man was practically running alongside me, smile still carved into his face, bag still swinging in his hand, liquid and whatever else it contained sloshing around inside. I made it inside and locked the doors and windows, but outside I could still see the two pale shadows lurking, taking on the form of a man before disappearing again. I left Pennsylvania not long after that. It lost all its charm for me, but when I lay down in bed at night, all I could see when I closed my eyes is the gray man off in the distance. distance. He gets closer every night, and I know someday he'll catch me. My wife's long black hair swept over her shoulder as she turned to tell me to hurry up. 6 miles into the hike, and she was still bounding with energy, while I neared the brink of collapse. Bang, 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 bang. Taking no notice of the pounding that had just drifted through the trees, she paused to allow me to catch up with her, and tease me for becoming an old man. Our 10th time making the trek, an annual tradition to return to the place where I'd proposed, and she looked as beautiful as she had on the first. Bang, 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 bang. It was louder now, enveloping us. Desperately, I tried to ignore it too, fighting to stay in the moment, fighting to stay with her. I knew what was waiting if I gave in. Bang, bang, bang. I opened my eyes, and she was gone. And I was back there. Light bringing no warmth streamed in through the window, and I shivered, uselessly pulling the meager, moth-bitten sheets tighter to my body. A full month's worth of frigid mornings had taught me to expect the chill air forcing its way through the cracks in the crumbling plaster walls, which brought with it the scent of fresh snow. And so continues the endless winter in hell, I grumbled, half awake as I reached blindly towards the bedside table and wrapped my hand around the glass that I knew would be waiting there, full to the brim with poisonous medicine. Swallowing its entire contents in 2 large gulps, I gagged on the flavor of tepid, watered-down, cheap whiskey, potent enough to keep the shakes at bay, yet not quite so strong as to bring any measure of real peace. At least its pain-numbing qualities exceeded those of the booze in the outside world, allowing me to choke back the tears brought on by my shattered back. Bang, 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 bang. The cacophony that had woken me continued down the first floor. From the sound of it, our fresh arrival was still violently trying to come to terms with his new living arrangements, angrily shouting, pounding on the walls and based on the scraping and then the loud crashes that followed, attempting to hurl the dining room chairs through the windows. Henry will be furious about having to rebuild those again, I murmured. I took another swig from the glass that, by then, had refilled itself, and listened more closely to the man's words. With only 2 semesters of college Spanish under my belt, it was some time before I recognized anything that he was screaming. Donde esté la puerta was the only thing I picked out that I fully understood. It will return soon enough, I thought to myself, polishing off my second helping of swill and setting the glass back on the table, feeling the weight of those words more heavily given the events of the last couple days. Best not focus on that part, though. I shuddered, propping my back up against the metal bars of the headboard and reaching once again for my only comfort in there, topped off as it was, for a 3rd time. Confined to my bed for the foreseeable future, I heard Henry's door open and his footsteps thump past mine as I knew, for the 3rd day in a row, he was going to attempt and calm the fresh tenant. Watching the haggard, dirty, broken man in the mirror that faced the bed raise the glass once again to his lips, I reflected back on my first day in the winter house. 2 years. It was 2 years to the day that I lost Sherry. It all happened so quickly. We were on our anniversary hike when, for the first time in our relationship, she fell behind me. Then, without warning, collapsed in the middle of the trail. Hospital visits, tests, diagnosis, treatment, fighting, losing, withering. Dead. 6 months. That's all it took. 37 years of healthy existence, 10 years of happy marriage. So much life still left in front of her. Dead. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the high-pitched squeal of the machine announcing to me that her heart had stopped when I felt the last of her strength evaporate from the hands I was holding. For the next 2 years, I tried to carry on without her. Did everything I knew to pull myself out of the swirling pit of despair I dropped into the moment she stopped breathing. Friends, family, hiking, lifting, church. I even debated going to therapy. But my father had always told me that that was only for weak men. Every day I fell deeper into the hole, and every day the bottle loomed nearer. You see, Sherry and I had met in Alcoholics Anonymous. She was already 3 months sober at the time and comforted me on the very first day. Helped see me through the worst of my detox. Kept me going back to meetings. Became my biggest advocate. We were two broken souls that had enough pieces left to hold each other together. And once she was gone, mine was shattered once more. She had made me promise that I would keep my sobriety in her absence. Made me swear it on the ring she'd worn on her hand every day of our marriage, and that I then wore around my neck every day after her passing. Yet one night I found myself in a bar. A bar I'd been to many times in my pre-Sherry life. A bar so familiar that, although I hung my head in shame, the feet I was watching carried me to a stool that, even after years of neglect, still felt like home when I sat in it. And without me uttering a single word, a drink appeared beside me. Alright. The bartender winked and asked where I'd been before shuffling off to take another patient and grabbed a plastic cup from the cabinet. Given I was already nearly toppling over with each step, I was certain I'd shatter anything glass if I tried to use it, and therefore was more than happy to fill my NASCAR chalice with a heavy dose of whiskey and ice. The next hour or so, I melted into the couch watching trash TV, working myself halfway through the 5th I'd purchased. It wasn't long before I passed out, empty vessel in hand, dreamlessly fading into nothing. I awoke with a headache, around 3 in the morning, needing to pee fiercely, and stupidly, I tried to sprint to the restroom, kicking the coffee table on the way there. The line pain seared through what I imagined was likely a broken pinky toe in my right foot, necessitating that I limp the rest of my way to the toilet in our master bedroom. After I had finished my business, I debated brushing my teeth and laying down in bed for the rest of the night. But with the way my head was feeling, I knew that if I didn't get some more alcohol into my system before I fell asleep again, the morning would be horrendous. And walking back into our bedroom, I caught sight of something I hadn't noticed when I'd crossed through the space with my eyes bleary from the tears of my shattered toe. There was a glass on my bedside table, brimming with a brown liquid and ice effortlessly floating through it, tinkling softly as the cubes moved up and down. It appeared as if someone had just placed it there a moment ago. I blinked repeatedly to make sure it didn't disappear, but after closing my eyes and opening them for the 4th time, I resigned myself to its reality and focused then on how it could have gotten there. As I mentioned, I was only planning to drink out of my plastic cup for the evening. Moreover, as far as I was aware, I'd been knocked out on the couch until about 5 minutes prior. Had it been there when I came into the room initially? I pondered. It must have been, unless there was someone else in the house with me. My heart rate increased, considering the possibility that someone had invaded my home, and I stood stock still for a minute, listening intently for the sound of any other movement in the house. But all that met my ears was the gentle click of the ice, which I felt should have settled by that time. Yet when I looked back at the table, it was impossibly still stirring, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. grabbing a baseball bat from the closet. I planned then to search the house and started first by checking what I had in my drunken stupor. Remembered to lock the front door. Sherry and I had had a break-in a couple years before she passed, and I had personally installed a special deadbolt that used keys which I made myself. Of those keys, there were only 2 in existence, and of those 2, I retained sole possession. So when I reached the door and found that I had indeed thrown the bolt behind me, and I had returned home earlier, I relaxed slightly, confident that no one could have picked the lock and entered through the main entrance. I conducted a thorough search of the remainder of the modest domicile. In doing so, I established that all other doors and all of the windows were locked, sealed, and undamaged, and I detected no trace of anyone besides myself within the walls. I was alone. So, I returned to my bedroom, praying as I crossed the threshold that the beverage would simply have vanished, and I could chalk the whole thing up to a hallucination. But I was sorely disappointed. There it still stood, solid as the moment I first laid eyes on it, ice continuing to bob up and down. The only explanation that I had for its presence then was that I had woken up, or maybe even sleepwalked, sometime before I had arisen to pee, made myself a drink, placed it down next to my bed, and wandered back to the couch. But why would I do that? I confusedly considered. If that had been what happened, I would have had to have it done it very recently, as the ice looked on melted. And it seemed so odd that I wouldn't have drank any of it before heading back to the living room. However, as it was the only explanation I could come up with that made any sense to me, and given I had been on my way to the kitchen to fix another drink before I spotted the one already waiting for me, I begrudgingly accepted that it must be the truth, brushing off the concerns that kept popping up in my head. With that, I approached the table and saw that as I did, my footsteps shook the contents, answering for me how it had appeared to be in a constant state of disturbance. I had been stomping around the house and creating the vibrations that were making it look alive. So easily, I ignored all of my worries. So easily, I lifted the glass from the table. So easily, I took a sip. And it was euphoria. The most delicious drink that had ever passed my lips. In fact, the most delicious thing I'd ever consumed in my life. Far beyond the quality of the piss I knew to be sitting in the plastic bottle in the kitchen that it should have tasted like. But I didn't care. I couldn't stop myself. Down, down, down. I gulped its entirety down in a wild frenzy, unable to move from the spots, unable to care for anything else. I ate the ice. I licked the inner walls of the glass clean. I was about to bite down on the glass itself when I snapped out of it. For a moment I felt nothing, but then as I lowered the empty container from my face, I was struck with an intense surge of pleasure. Every nerve ending surged with warmth. Every pain I'd ever known drifted away. Sherry's hollow, sickened face dissolved from my memories and was replaced with the smile that greeted my mornings for so many years. I needed more. Then, as if a bartender had heard my thoughts, I looked down to see the glass was full again. Madly, I snatched it up, draining the elixir even faster than the first helping, and I was rewarded. I began tingling with the sensations of every joyous minute I'd ever experienced. The best days of my life all flashed before my eyes. The smell of Sherry's perfume crept into my nostrils. At that moment, I was positive that I was happiest being on the planet. While I basked in bliss, a voice rose from the back of my mind, carrying with it only one word. More, it demanded. The glass was full again, and the third dose barely lasted a second. I felt Sherry's arms around my waist, wrapping me in a hug from behind, the weight of her head pressed down on my shoulder as she pulled me gently down onto the bed. Lovingly, she ran her fingers through my hair and whispered tenderly in my ear, "Don't worry, I've got you now." It was so sweet to hear her voice again, so sweet to feel her warmth beside me. "I've got you now," she repeated, yet this time the tenderness was gone. This time, a darkness filled each syllable. Panic replaced ecstasy, but I was helpless to do anything about it. Overwhelming exhaustion overcame me, and I was forced powerlessly into a heavy and dreamless slumber. Sunlight shone on the inside of my eyelids, and I cracked them open to find it was morning. Nothing about my bedroom appeared different than any other time I'd woken up there, besides that it was absolutely freezing for the middle of summer. Yanking the covers closer to me, I cocooned myself to attempt and warm my bones, but it was to little avail. A pounding headache prevented the events of the previous evening from returning immediately, but when I rotated my head to look at the clock on the bedside table, there was an empty space on it that I knew, for some reason, should have been occupied. The glass was gone. It all came back to me, and I, with a start, sat up in bed, quickly to be greeted with an incredible bout of nausea. Frantically, I ran for the restroom and began to vomit so furiously. I worried that I might not just expel what was inside my stomach, but actually launch my stomach itself into the toilet. It was the most miserable I had ever felt. A hangover so severe that I legitimately considered calling for an ambulance. You would have thought that in that instant, I'd be swearing off alcohol forever. Yet in reality, once I felt assured that I had nothing left inside my body to chuck up, the first thing I did was crawl like a baby to the kitchen to find my leftover whiskey from the night before. Any alcoholic can tell you that the fastest way to cure alcohol withdrawal is to consume more alcohol. So, with trembling hands, I snatched a half-empty bottle down from the counter and, foregoing any imitations of sophistication, took 2 large pulls directly from it. I gagged and my stomach churned. It took every ounce of my fortitude to keep it down, but I was able to hold it. Sitting on the floor, I leaned against a cabinet and continued to take small sips every few minutes while I waited for it to take effect, and gradually I began to feel the hangover symptoms subsiding. Once I was able to focus on anything other than feeling horribly ill, I thought again about the night before, about the mysterious glass, about how perfect it made me feel. With its conspicuous absence that morning, I wondered if it had all been a very lucid dream. Maybe it really had been a hallucination brought on by the binge I'd gone on after such a long period of sobriety. Whatever the case, as the whiskey displaced more and more of the healthy ingredients of my blood, I focused less on the likely imagined events of the night before, and more on the growing hunger. With that sensation returning, I knew that I would be feeling well enough to stand and hold myself to my feet. Swaying a bit more than I expected, I continued to take intermittent gulps of drink as I managed to fumble my way through a shower, teeth brushing, and getting dressed, so that I could at least head out to get a greasy fast food breakfast and another bottle for the afternoon. Feeling at least presentable enough for the liquor store, I stepped out through the front door, closed it behind me, and turned my key in the deadbolt to lock it. And when I spun it back to the center position to remove the key from the door, it got stuck. Yanking on it as hard as I could, it refused to pull free from the lock. I tried jiggling it a bit, but couldn't shake it loose. Then I tried twisting it back to the locked position, but it wouldn't budge that direction either. Annoyed, I was about to head to my truck to grab some of my smithing tools to force it to come out, when something happened. The key rotated on its own to unlock the door. I stared at it in disbelief for a moment. There was no way that should have been possible. Even if someone was standing on the other side of the door and had spun the deadbolt handle, it wouldn't have moved the key externally. Confused but significantly inebriated such that I was more frustrated than scared at the time, I tried to turn it back to lock the door again, but found it was now frozen in the unlocked position. Unsure of what to make of the situation, I decided to open the door to begin unchanged. There were the stairs leading up to the floor that could not exist. Fear began to eat its way through my liquid courage, and I reflected back on the glass from the night before. Maybe it hadn't been a dream. Maybe I'd been drugged. Maybe it was part of a government experiment of some kind with LSD. There needed to be a sane explanation for what I was seeing, as it was impossible that my door had randomly decided to open itself into another home. I went to take another step back, as my instinct then was to take off running, but before I could, a hand shot out from behind the door, a hand the size of my chest, a hand with haphazard, jagged spines jutting from the back of it, pointed fingers as long as my forearms wrapped themselves around my wrist, and I was pulled inside the dismal foyer before being violently thrown to the ground near the foot of the steps.